In myth, it's always a reference to things. Did that go away? I said eternal things in the microphone. Headed for the other world. And one of the reasons why humans feel pain and why humans seek for beauty is because we have that eternal thing inside us, that divine word that won't let us settle, for the latest idea or for some normality. We're seeking something beyond normal and something divine, but sometimes we have to go through something very dark to get there. I should mention, just on the basis of mythology, it isn't the end of the world we're worried about. At least I'm not, because this world is tied to the eternal world. And when you get to the end of things, call it the end of time, what you find is the roots of eternity, because that's where time comes from. And so in a mythological sense, the world can't end. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do we do when it seems like it's about to? That's the real story, I think. As a matter of fact, the word end has no end. It doesn't mean finito, goodbye, lights out, all over. The word end means loose end or remnant. And when we get to the end, there's a remnant, a thread from which the whole thing begins again. So that's another way to understand the turning. We're in the darkness that turns back to the light. At least we hope so. And if we're not, we're going to act as if it's true. Because it's way more charming and possible and stylish than simply getting caught in the darkness. One of the names for the human soul is the light found inside darkness. So there's a light in our own souls that knows how to see with the eyes, the darkened eyes, which is another name for wisdom, dark knowledge. So maybe we've entered into that period. At any rate, it might also be helpful to know that this has kind of happened before. Mythologically speaking, it's all happened before. And so there are many myths about the end. North American tribes, several tribes, have the story of how it all started to come apart and people turned against each other and everybody began to fight about the slightest thing that came up. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And no one knew what to do. And so finally someone said we should go to the oldest animal on the earth, because the animals remember how things work. And they decided the oldest known animal was an old eagle grandmother who lived in a cave up in the mountains. And so they trekked up into the mountains and they found the cave, and in there was the old eagle grandmother. And they told her what was going on, that down on the earth, the people, the two-leggeds they call them, were really in big trouble. They had gone really blind and they were afraid of everything. And there was even a tea party, and it was a real wreckage. And it was starting to seem that there was no hope for anything. And could she please help? And being deep and old and compassionate and instinctive, she took out her heart and she gave it to them. And she said, what's missing is the rhythm of life. So take my heart back and use that to bring everybody together, because people have fallen out of rhythm with the world. And that heart that she gave them became a drum. And when you see people beating on one of those big drums, that's what they're beating on, the heart of the grandmother eagle that was trying to return life to its natural rhythm. So that's one little story. And then you might say, what is that man doing in the middle of a cathedral with a drum? You could answer it a couple of ways. It has a bit of a heartbeat in it. The frame of it is actually a tree. It's a part of a tree over which a generous goat has laid itself. And it's used to bring rhythm back when things get broken. And so this is an old story from South America about what happens when the world consumes itself. So once upon a time, once, a long time ago, not in this time and not in this place, but once in another time, it happened that the element of fire ran out of control and everything became so fired up and so overheated that flames began to burn in all the corners of the earth. And no one could stop the burning that had begun. And the fires continued to grow. And soon enough, all of the trees and bushes and plants and green growing things have been consumed by the fire and turned to ash. And even the mountains melted, and the rocks and the stones melted in the heat of the fire that broke loose over the earth. And the living beings were consumed as well. And pretty soon, everything that you would recognize of the earth had been reduced to ashes, and the entire earth was nothing but a sea of ash. And then it happened that there were two beings that had not been on the earth when the fire broke loose and consumed everything. For something is always left alive. And those two beings had been in the other world, the world behind this world, the world around this world, when this world was consumed with flames and reduced to ash. And now they were longing to return home to their place on earth where they had begun. And so they began to fly from the other world back to the other world, back to this world. For they were like bird beings. It was a long time ago. And they were bird beings that could fly between the worlds. And so the two of them began to fly back. And as they were flying over the world and seeing that everything had been reduced to ashes, they came upon the trickster. And the trickster said, you know, if you want to find home in this confusing world, you should keep your index fingers pointed before you. And when your index finger begins to point down, you will be above your home and you can descend. And so those two bird beings stuck out their index fingers. The story doesn't explain how they can be flying like birds and sticking out index fingers. It's a very old story. You need a deep imagination in order to follow, but you get the idea. They were flying along in that fashion. The two of them, one named Ikanshu, the other named Shuna, when sure enough their index fingers began to point down, and they began to descend from the height of the heavens down to the earth that looked like nothing but a sea of ashes. When they came to the spot that should have been home, they didn't recognize anything and they didn't know what to do, but as soon as they touched the earth, they began to feel very hungry, and so they began to dig in the ashes to see if there was anything left that they might eat, and they could find nothing at all until Ikanshu happened to knock against something hard down there in the pile of ash, and he reached down and found a piece of charcoal, and he brought it up and looked at it and dusted the ashes off and realized this was the only remaining thing from the forest of trees that had stood around the village where they had lived. And as he held it in his hand, the thought occurred to him that trees were also used to make drums. And he thought, since I can't eat this piece of charred and burned charcoal, maybe I could play it as a drum. And so Ikanshu began to play the only remnant of all the trees in the forest, that little piece of charcoal, like a drum. And he drummed and he drummed, and as long as he was drumming, he decided he may as well dance right there in the ashes of the end of the world. And as long as he was dancing and drumming, he decided he might as well sing right there in the ashes while he was dancing, and that's what he did. He sang and he danced and he played the drum of charcoal, the remainder of the world, until he became so tired that he laid down in the ashes and went to sleep, and darkness came and chased the light of the world away. And then in the morning, for the morning always follows the dark, when the light came, Ikanshu got up and looked around for his piece of charcoal. And when he found it, he could see that there was a little green, slender sapling beginning to grow from the piece of charcoal that he had found in the ashes and had played like a drum. Realizing what was going on, Ikanshu began to dance around that charcoal. And as he danced around, he sang. And as he sang and as he danced there in the ashes of the end of the world, the little slender sapling began to grow, and it grew rapidly, and it grew thick, and pretty soon it was standing up like the trunk of a tree. And Ikanshu kept singing, and he kept dancing, and as he did it, branches began to grow out from the sapling that had become a trunk like a tree, and the branches were now growing in all directions, and pretty soon anyone could see that it was the tree of life coming back with green and elegant and long branches that spread out over the world. And suddenly, as Ikanshu was dancing, his foot hit something hard in the ashes again, and he reached down and pulled it out, and he had in his hand a rock, a stone, and without thinking at all, intuitively or instinctively, Ikanshu, who had been dancing around the sapling that became the trunk of the tree of life, suddenly hurled the stone at the branches of the tree of life. And it might seem a little anti-ecological or environmentally unfriendly, but you never know what's going to work when it's all come down to darkness and ashes. And as soon as that rock hit one of the branches that were growing from the renewed tree of life, the branch fell into the ashes, and it too began to grow like a tree. And now Ikanshu was digging in the ashes, trying to find as many stones as he could find. And each time he found a stone, he would throw it at a branch of the tree of life. And each time he hit a branch, it would fall into the ashes. And each time a branch hit the ashes, it would grow quickly into a tree. And each branch that fell turned into a new species of tree. And pretty soon, between the dancing and the throwing of rocks and the falling and the growing of branches, all of the species of all the trees of the world began to come back. And pretty soon all of the trees came back, and the forest came back, and after the forest came back, the mountains came back, and pretty soon the animals came back, and then the birds came back, and after that, pretty soon the people came back. And soon enough, the whole world had been reconstituted from one piece of charcoal left over after the world had almost entirely consumed itself. And then the world began again. Of course, people began making mistakes again and doing things in backwards and sideways ways. That's the world. That's the way of the world. But the people that tell this story get together once a year when a certain kind of fruit is ripe on the branches of the trees, and they all go out and they look at the trees and they celebrate the beauty of all the trees, that each one represents the tree on which life grows. And after enjoying the beauty of it, they each look for a few rocks, and then they begin to throw the rocks at the branches of the tree. And each time they hit some of the ripened fruit, the fruit falls down, and they pick up the fruit and they give it one to the other, sharing the fruit of the tree and remembering the story of how the world begins. And maybe we ourselves could begin doing some of that dancing and some of that singing and some of that standing in the ashes and in the raw beauty of the possibility of all the fruit and all the trees and all the ripening come back again. Maybe we too could try that. Thank you.